how the Congress makes laws that affect their particular businesses, how we can educate lawmakers and staff as to what the impact of those laws and regulations are, and where there are serious problems that are affecting economic growth, job creation, and the like. We try to persuade lawmakers of those negative impacts and try to fix the laws and regulations so they better serve the American people.
Excellent. That's perfect. That's great. I wanted to make sure that we established that so that everyone understood exactly what it was that you did, because not everybody totally understands what, there's so many different roles, and you hear these, you look at things like Fox News, and then they put like what your title is underneath your little name. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? And like, well, what does that person do? What's the difference between a political analyst and a political pundit and that kind of thing? So whenever I have a guest on the show, I always like to kind of lay that out. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, if I can just elaborate there, because you raised a very important point here, Melanie, and a lot of times what we see on the cable news shows are Democratic strategists and Republican strategists. So those tend to be professionals who are aligned specifically with one party or another, and that becomes their branding. So, a political strategist will largely work just with Republican-leaning clients, with Republican lawmakers to fix issues on the Republican side, and same thing with the Democratic strategist. We're government relations professionals. Look at the party of our clients, whether one is a Republican, one is a Democrat. Those two parties together make the Congress work. So we work with whoever needs to be worked with to solve problems for the private sector. So we tend to take a nonpartisan approach to professional issues, but in a personal capacity, I, of course, have a conservative disposition and have worked largely with Republican lawmakers over the course of my career, but I've never let that get in the way of doing deals with Democrats where it's important to fix problems for industry, for our economy, and to do good things for our country, which is really the hallmark of our work.
Oh, wow. That's an excellent point. I'm glad I brought that up now because that is an excellent point. That's an excellent point. Now, I when I was doing research for the show and just doing some research on your company and your background, I stumbled across a Washington Times article from December 2006 that you wrote called "The National Infrastructure Dilemma. It may fail spectacularly if environmental regulations aren't reformed first," and it talked about all the infrastructure planning that President Trump had planned, and just how financing is always going to be an issue was the gist of it. And then you pointed out that even if he nails down the financing through a marrying of private funding and government funding, the environmental revelations could stop him dead in his tracks. He might not even get that settled by the end of his term. So, right? And it's so true. So I was hoping you would lay out for the audience what exactly we mean when we talk about regulatory compliance, because it is such a broad term, and what it means in terms of specifically in a governmental standpoint and how it affects businesses. And if that's too broad, then correct me, narrow it for me, I guess I should say.
Well, first of all, Melanie, let me just say thank you for bringing that article up. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk about what we assess in that article and where there may be some very serious roadblocks if President Trump and the Congress together are going to work to enact a major national infrastructure bill, which I think would be a wonderful jobs-creating program across the United States. And when we talk about regulatory compliance, I hope if we have enough time, I have to defer to you on that, the economic impact and the job destruction that comes also from environmental regulations as it pertains to home construction, to agriculture, and even as it comes to biotechnology and to bringing life-saving medicines to the American people and for that matter to people around the world. So the regulatory compliance issues are very burdensome across the spectrum, but on this particular one, the infrastructure proposal that Donald Trump has put forward, first of all, I think has got about 75 to 85% support among the American people across all backgrounds, all strata, because people get it. First of all, we're in desperate need of significant infrastructure restoration. Anybody who gets on the metro in DC or in a lot of other cities knows what kind of problems we face with mass transportation. Anybody who gets in a car and drives across a road or a bridge knows about the potholes that have been left over for the last several winters across the United States. And anybody who flies in and out of our airports, especially to an international airport, sees what spectacular infrastructure we see in Asia, in South Asia, in Africa, in Europe, and yet we don't see it here in the United States of America. So this has got to get done, but the environmental regulations that are required for the simplest infrastructure project basically delay anything, especially with wide-ranging impact, by at least 2 to 4 years. And without reforming those compliance requirements first and getting it down to, say, a mandatory 1-year close on all reviews so that a project can proceed, I'm afraid that Donald Trump is going to be talking about infrastructure, but not a single jackhammer is going to hit the pavement until these reforms are enacted.
Exactly. And that was one of my concerns and worries about him becoming president in the first place. Not that he wasn't capable, but that he did not understand just how slowly government moves. That was a concern.
But Melanie, can I bring up one very interesting anecdote? And this goes back to my New York days. This is back in the 1980s. And I don't know if your listeners are aware of this also, but one of the ways that Donald Trump first came to prominence in New York, not only by being a very successful developer and making himself a known presence in the New York social circuit, but we actually had a glaring example of the failure of government with a simple infrastructure project, and that is to repair what was known as the Wallman skating rink in Central Park. And I think the cost overruns were about $20 million, and it took 2.5, 3 years, and they still couldn't get a simple skating rink to function properly. And Donald Trump could see the construction from his office, the Trump Tower, overlooking Central Park South, and finally made an issue out of it publicly and said, what kind of a city do we have that we can't fix a simple skating rink? They've wasted all this money, they've wasted all this time, and nobody's ice skating yet. And so Mayor Ed Koch at the time said, okay, Ed Koch, basically, okay, Donald Trump, I'm throwing this on your lap. Go ahead and fix it. And Donald Trump back then fixed this for 1/3 the price, ahead of schedule, and really made a name for himself as a can-do entrepreneur who can take a government problem and fix it with private sector solutions. I think he'd like to do that with a national infrastructure project, but the obstacles are enormous, Melanie. And I have to be clear here, this is not just a Donald Trump problem. The Congress has to approve, has to come up with and has to approve environmental reform so that we have a balance.
Yes.
We need to protect the environment. We need to be good stewards of our natural resources, but we can't let these become excuses for not building anything in America anymore.
Yes, exactly. And I'd love for you to talk about what you touched on before, because that is exactly where I wanted to go and exactly why I wanted to talk to you about the cost of regulatory compliance, because I was not just talking about the financial cost, which is what I said in my open, was that, we're not just discussing financial costs here. We're talking about time cost. We're talking about, we're talking about costs. It costs us. So please do elaborate on some of the things that you talked about earlier about how burdensome these regulations on the world at large. And you can start out locally, domestically, if you will, and expand from there.
Well, let me offer the example of some companies that I've worked with from the West Coast, Melanie, because what happens is, and this is not just a Washington phenomenon, most people on the East Coast aren't aware that the way the federal environmental regulatory agencies work is they start to creep their regulations forward outside the overview of the Congress out on the West Coast, where you still have a lot of open land and a lot of population growth. And so you need to be able to develop, again, in a balanced way, that you have city councilmen, mayors, county officials who are trying to balance environmental conservation and stewardship with the need to grow their societies, to grow their communities. But the federal government, and specifically here, in particular, the Fish and Wildlife Service, for instance, has listed something called a fairy shrimp. And some of the older men, people from my generation, listening to your show, may remember reading comic books and sending in a quarter to a company and getting a little tin packet of something called seahorses, which are little white eggs. You put them in water, and you get these tiny invertebrates. They're called fairy shrimp, and they're about the size of a pinky nail. And the birds come down and eat them, and it's part of the natural food chain. These are found by the billions, Melanie, on millions of acres of farmland throughout California's Central Valley. But because there's development happening, the Fish and Wildlife Service says, well, the habitat of these fairy shrimp is being threatened, so we have to declare them endangered. And as a result, we've seen not only major residential projects get held up, but major commercial projects. I was involved in a project that involved the federal government holding up the construction of a major medical facility, a hospital in the suburbs of a major city in California. The population was being underserved because they had to drive 30, 40 minutes to get to the major facilities that were already in place. But the federal government came in and said, overriding county officials who wanted this hospital, and said, well, we're not really sure this is a good place for a hospital, despite the fact that it was next to a major highway, next to 130-year-old railroad tracks, and everything around it had already been developed. And they said, yeah, but you know what? There is some habitat here for these fairy shrimp and some other endangered species, mostly insects and grasses. So we think it's good for you to move this hospital someplace else. And Melanie, as you well know, the federal government is not supposed to be involved in local zoning issues. That's the job of local officials. They know what's best for their citizens and for the local community. But the feds came in because they wanted to exercise control over a project that they have no authority to conduct any jurisdiction over. And it's just one example of how the federal government establishes precedent in a place like the West Coast. And once they've got that precedent, they start to apply to the Midwest and to the East Coast slowly over time. And the Congress has pretty much sat by, Democrats and Republicans, and allowed this regulatory creep to march forward unobstructed.
That is unbelievable. That's unbelievable. And I want to say to my audience, for those of you who have never been involved in your local government, first of all, I want to say this before I even get to that. For all of the areas of government that we have, we have our local, state, and federal government. Your local government is the one that affects your daily life the most. So if you can get involved in your local government, do so. You definitely want to do that. And as someone who has served on the zoning board before, I can tell you that Mr. Sitilides is absolutely right about what he says about local zoning, local planning boards. That they are the ones who are supposed to be doing the regulating. The feds are way out of bounds and getting involved in that. But here's the thing, Mr. Sitilides, answer me this: how does a local zoning board, how does a local community keep the feds from sticking their nose in local business? How do you do that?
Well, I have to admit, Melanie, it's very difficult if you don't have the support of your federal lawmakers. So, Washington, D.C. has got a member of Congress. There's no Senate representation for D.C. Other parts of the country, local officials have got to get the ear and the attention of members of Congress and of senators to be able to weigh in on the agencies and instruct them to back off, that local zoning issues are not the business, they're not the purview of federal government agencies. Their job is to regulate interstate commerce. So when something affects commerce between states, the federal government has a role to play there. When something is a purely local matter, it's not the job of the federal government to get involved. The problem has been, Melanie, that the Congress has largely abdicated its oversight role. And it's very easy for them to say, well, our hands are tied, the agencies are doing A, B, and C, and whatnot. And unfortunately, many lawmakers don't want to stick their necks out in support of one position because they're afraid of scaring off or angering the opposing side. So most lawmakers want to have as many constituents, as many voters as happy as possible. But we're voting for political leaders, not simply people with fancy titles. And leadership means you have to lead people in a certain direction. You have to inspire them. You have to educate them. You have to explain what your vision is, as to say, in this case, what the proper relationship is between federal agencies and local zoning authorities, and inform people that the feds need to stay out of those areas that are not their business and simply stay involved in those areas that are their business, and free up local officials to do the work of the people at the local level. But if you don't have senators and members of Congress backing you up on that, Melanie, unfortunately, it's very difficult. So we have to get the Congress to reassert its proper role and defend local authorities against federal overreach and regulatory encroachment.
Absolutely. 100%. And you can't elect local authorities that are wusses, frankly.
No, you can't. And this isn't anything. This isn't just involve regulations. You know, this happens across the United States. It happens around the world. A lot of people love running for public office because they get to have a very nice title and very nice benefits paid for by taxpayers. I'm happy to give them that title and those benefits, but their job is to lead, to make tough decisions, and to do good things to the public and the public interest. And simply having a fancy title and lots of benefits and walking around with your thumbs in your armpits saying, I'm so-and-so and I'm so-and-so, does nothing to advance the public interest. Meanwhile, we're paying our hard-earned taxes. So we need our political leaders to actually be doing things all the time, because there are so many problems to fix at the local level, the county level, the state level, national and internationally. So those people that we elect, we pay them to do the job. And if they don't do the job, they should be removed from office next time there's a vote count.
Absolutely. And let the church say amen to that.
Amen. Amen, Melanie. I hear you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, you know, part of the problem is, I feel, and I don't know if you agree, that, you know, many people, many voters don't quite understand what you just laid out, the order of things, if you will, the headship principle, if you wanted to get scriptural about it, as far as our government is concerned, that there is a principle here. There is an order of things, and that, you know, the federal government can't just come in and do what they do. And you have local officials that take advantage of that and say, well, you know, we really can't do anything about it because the feds came in and did that. And it's like, no, that's not really the case. You really can do something about it, but you're just being a wuss.
You know, you raise a great point, Melanie, and this is a problem nationally. And unfortunately, I mean, we're not going to get into a longer discussion about education, but I think our education system has failed us in that they don't teach our children, and our children grow up to become the next generation of leaders, of adults, of course, about basic civics in the United States. So our Constitution calls for a federal system where each level of government has its own responsibilities. And it's what makes America, I would say, an exceptional country. If you go to a smaller country in another part of the world, everything is dominated by a central government. But you can do that because, for instance, a large country in Europe, say Turkey or Germany, they're the sizes of Texas or Montana. So you can have one government that basically runs a country that size, the size of one of our states. But the United States of America is just that. It's 50 different states that have agreed to work together to advance a common good as a nation, but only limited powers for the federal government that cover national interests and our international position. But states have an enormous amount of authority in each part of the country, and within each state, you have dozens of counties that take care of issues at that level. And of course, within the counties, you have cities and towns. And I would argue that I think experience and history and wisdom tells us that the best relationships are those that people have directly with their local leaders.
Yep.
Those are the people that know the streets and the communities and the civic centers better than anybody else. And the bigger the problem, the higher the level of government you have to go to. But the more localized the problem or the issue, you want your local officials to address that, not some people in a faraway capital city. So it's a beautiful system that we have in the United States, but maybe we need to do a better job of educating our fellow Americans about how to make this work better at every level.
Absolutely. We're up against a break. We're going to go to a break real quick. We're talking to John Sitilides. We'll be back in a couple of moments.
Hey, it's Jersey Joe from the Reaver, Common Sense. You can catch me every Wednesday night, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on shrmedia.com. That's every Wednesday night, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, shrmedia.com. The best late-night conservative talk show in America, Analyst Radio. Listen, there's no people better on the air to give you the best in conservative talk than Sackhead Sean and Sackhead Clint. And we're working on immigration papers for a certain other guy that happens to work here too. For those who are tuning in around the world to the best late night conservative talk, Sackheads Radio. The best late night conservative talk show in America. In America. And in this web was a large, I'm pretty sure it was the biggest spider I've ever seen.
The election of Donald J. Trump was an amazing victory, but that was just the beginning. Hello, I'm Ron Edwards. On today's page from the Edwards Notebook, America the Beautiful has been under a horrendously ugly progressive-leaning attack for decades. The effort to turn the United States into a socialist progressive hellhole is a non-stop effort. Thus, it is more imperative than ever to not sit on our laurels and allow the progressives to continue to destroy the United States through the indoctrination of our republic's student population, in the classroom or even in progressive-oriented churches. For what is taught to one generation dictates the direction the nation takes in the next. The Donald will soon take on the monumental task of dealing with the restoration of the economy, religious liberty, our borders, the protection of the unborn, etc., etc. The progressives are going through stages of grief as they try to bring about unrest, but will ultimately fail. Enjoy the victory, America, but keep up the fight against those who long to destroy your republic. God bless you, God bless America, and may America bless God.
Happy days are here again.
I'm Ron Edwards.
Power brokers use corrupt politicians, deceptive Islam, and lies from establishment media to turn the once shining city on a hill into the city of the blind. What do the elites fear? One man with a cane. I'm Dave Milner. Join me at SHR Media, High Plains Talk Radio, Spreaker, iTunes, and YouTube for a different kind of commentary on the unpleasant blind guy. Because truth is not always pleasant.
The bloviating Zeppelin. He's big-footed enough radio shows to last a lifetime, courtesy of Sean, Clint, Ken, and Jersey Joe. Now it's time for him to waddle on his own 2 feet via the glorious SHR Media. Gird thy loins for the bloviating Zeppelin's Berserk Bobcat Saloon. Coming soon to Ossicles near you. Excelsior.
You
listening to the Exceptional Conservative Network. For more information, go to www.theexceptionalconservative.com.
Okay, we are back. You are listening to Money Talk with Melanie. This is your business diva, Melanie Collette. We have with us John Sitilides from Trilogy Advisors. He is a political analyst and a complete and total rock star, giving us so much information this morning on the cost of regulatory burdens, really, at all levels of government, local, state, and federal levels, especially, the environmental regulations are just amazing. They really are. I just don't listen. I love animals as much as the next person, but goodness gracious, the example that you gave us about the hospital over the tiny seahorse, like, really? Can we prioritize?
Well, let me give you a couple more, Melanie, if I might. And see, this is where a lot of the radical environmental organizations are very disingenuous. They're very deceptive with the American people. And almost all of their advertising features, polar bears and a little chunk of ice and the American bald eagle and these magnificent beasts that actually do need protection. And I think there's widespread consensus on that. But that's all they focus on. And so we're thinking that when we support these types of activities, that we're protecting the polar bears and the bald eagles. What they don't tell you is that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of species that are listed, the vast majority of which are plants, grasses, and insects. So that there are types of flies that are considered endangered or threatened species, which means if you do anything at all, even with your home, your private property, in an area that is habitat for any of these insects, you have to get a federal permit, and there's a very good chance you won't ever get a permit to do the kind of work you want to do. The agencies are brilliant here, Melanie. They don't tell you no. They just never tell you yes. And they wear you down by attrition. You have to keep submitting new information. They have more questions. The folder sits on somebody's desk for 6 months. And you want to do a simple construction project on your property, and you're waiting 1 year, 2 years, 3 years until you give up. And they've won without ever saying no to you. So that's one of the ways that they do it. And the other thing is, as I mentioned before, you've got plants, bushes, grasses. They're considered endangered species. And these are manipulated by federal regulators. For instance, down in Texas and New Mexico, there's a large area, Melanie, that's just been discovered as having vast fossil fuel resources, oil and natural gas. And it's almost all private property. So somebody spotted a lizard that nobody else had seen before. And so the bureaucrats are saying, well, if this is the only lizard that we've seen, it must be an endangered lizard. So we're going to have to categorize this entire area of hundreds of square miles as potentially endangered habitat for this endangered lizard, even though we've only seen one of them. And it's not meant to protect the lizard. It's meant to prevent any type of oil or natural gas drilling from taking place there, boosting jobs, providing greater energy resources, getting the cost of energy down for the American people. But they use these laws, I should say they exploit these laws for ulterior purposes, not for the purposes that the laws and regulations were meant to be enacted for.
That should be the definition of literally insane. Like, I don't, how imbalanced is that? To think that I don't understand these people. I don't.
But this is what you have right now in place at the EPA, at the Fish and Wildlife Service, at the Army Corps of Engineers. These are some of the major regulatory agencies. And it mostly comes out of the EPA because a lot of the people at the Army Corps of Engineers, which handles, for instance, port dredging and wetlands permitting and the like, they're there to do their job as technically effectively as they can. And same thing with Fish and Wildlife Service. But the problem is you've got ideological zealots at the EPA who really do believe that we have to return to this beautiful 19th century natural period before we had evil things like economic development and large cities and residential development. And they're exploiting our laws and regulations to do things that the Constitution never intended the federal government to do. I mean, the late Justice Scalia, Melanie, I don't know if you remember, one of his recent opinions had stated over the issue of clean water that the way the regulations were being enforced by the agencies, they could theoretically come into your kitchen sink and look at the kind of soap that you're using, that you're letting pour down your kitchen sink drain, and tell you that you are polluting navigable waters of the United States and be subject to fine or imprisonment if we carried out these regulations to their logical conclusion. So they haven't done that yet, and everybody makes fun of Justice Scalia, the late Justice Scalia.
Yes.
But there were things that were unimaginable 10 and 20 and 30 years ago in America that now not only are commonplace, but if you oppose them, you're considered an evil person.
Right.
So, you know, we have this kind of thing taking place with environmental regulations, and if we don't push back now, we're going to be stunned to see what the regulators do to us 10 and 20 years from now.
Now, I want you to tell our audience, hold on to, clutch your pearls, hold on to your hats when Mr. Sitilides tells you this. I want you to tell our audience how regulators, are they elected officials? Are they people that the people have chosen? And how ironclad are these regulations? Like, do these regulations go through the Congress? Does anybody vet these regulations? How does that work?
Great and very important questions you're asking, Melanie. These are civil servants, like civil servants who are involved in so many other parts of the government. The problem is that they bring a very dangerous ideology. I mean, they worship Mother Earth almost as a religion to replace what we would constitute to be Christianity or any other major faith. They worship at the altar of this environmentalism, which overtakes all reason, all logic, and the well-being of our fellow men and women. I mean, that really should be the primary purpose of government, to give people the freedom to do the things they want to do without harming other people or harming things that are our common good, our common interest. But these regulators, they tend to be ideologues. They have almost zero private enterprise or private sector experience.
Yep.
They never think about the human impact or the economic impact of their regulations. And unfortunately, Melanie, a lot of times they don't have to. The Congress, either in its erring ways or in its incompetence, has written laws or allowed regulators to create regulations that specifically state that no impact will be considered except the good of the endangered or threatened species or its habitat, which means human beings take place to grasses and to insects and to invertebrates, okay? And the economic impact is irrelevant. So if building a facility that will have like a hospital, that's a $30 million hospital and have tremendous benefits for millions of people, will cost $20 million in economic impact mitigation, then so be it. Even though the hospital can't be built for $50 million, it can only be built for 30, the regulators can't care about that. So it's all backwards, it's all upside down, and we just need to get our priorities straight again and say, yes, we need economic preservation, economic conservation, but it has to be balanced with human impact, with human good, and with human progress so that people can go back to work. People can have meaningful jobs. People can build their communities. But right now, the environmental regulations mean that grass and lowly insects have greater priority over the human interest.
That's right. And that is why I wanted to talk to you, because I wanted an expert to lay this out, because I wanted to, and I especially love that your company works with both sides of the aisle, that you lay this out and help both sides of the aisle in this regard, because it affects everyone, and it is bad for the country. And we're up against the close of the show. I am definitely going to have you back on. Please, before we go, tell the audience how they can get in touch with your company, how they can reach you, your contact information. If you wrote any books or anything, tell us how to get it. Go.
Oh, thank you very much, Melanie, for the opportunity to connect with your audience here. My website is my last name, SITILIDES.com or trilogyadvisors.net. I'd be happy to answer any questions via email from your audience, and I look forward to the opportunity to reconnect with you, Melanie, and do this great thing of bringing these important issues to the attention of your audience.
Thank you so much, because we have tons and tons to talk about. We didn't even scratch the surface today. You have so much fantastic information, and I just deeply appreciate you being on, and I look forward to having you back. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me, and God bless.
God bless. You have a great day.
Thank you, Melanie. You too.
All righty. Bye-bye.
Call ended.
Okay, you're listening to Money Talk with Melanie. We will be back in 1 moment.
It's time to celebrate, ladies and gentlemen. Ken McClinton and the Exceptional Conservative Show celebrate 7 years of excellence in broadcasting here on the Exceptional Conservative Network. 9:05 p.m. Monday through Thursday, the finest in conservative talk anywhere. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to celebrate! You are listening to the Exceptional Conservative Network. For more information, go to www.conservative.com.
Okay, thank you. You are listening to Money Talk with Melanie. I want to thank everyone for listening today. It was a fantastic show with Mr. John Sitilides, and I hope that you will join us again on Wednesday. Remember, this is all very important, ladies and gentlemen, because it is your money.